Kimberly Austin. Welcome to Rock Book Show. Joining me today is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, Bruce. Peter Ames Carlin, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see you.
Thank you. Well, as I mentioned, New York Times bestseller. Can we say it again? New York Times bestseller. Amazing reviews from longtime Bruce fans, Brian Williams and Jon Stewart. Longtime Bruce fans who may not be as famous are coming up to me and saying, I learned new things in this book. How does that feel?
Terrific. I mean, I worked on it for a long time and spent, tried to turn over every rock and beat every bush and try to find some new stuff and some new angles on Bruce. And it just, that stuff was there. It took some patience. It took some doing. But, I began to feel like I was making some headway, and having the book out and having people read it and feel like they're seeing something new in there too. It's what I was shooting for the whole time.
Yeah. And I learned a ton as well. Where did the process start?
Back in 2009, in the fall, I'd finished a book about Paul McCartney, and my editor was saying, "What do you want to do next? You should do something that you really love. Because those were the two things that bonded the book I wrote about Brian Wilson with the Paul McCartney book." And so I was like digging through, my childhood heroes, and I thought, well, who could be more, who am I more fascinated, in than Bruce Springsteen? It felt like a big target. It felt like, the Great White Rhino or something of rock biography subjects. But I just thought, if not now, then, when? And so, I gave a call to Dave Marsh, who I'd known through professional circles, and who has been had worked on great Bruce books in the 70s and the 80s, and done phenomenal writing, and has been a friend and a colleague of his since very early in Bruce's career. And I wasn't going to do a book if he was doing another one because it seemed pointless. And he said, "Well, I'm actually ready to give that one up, and so you should go ahead and do it." So I picked up the baton that Dave very kindly offered me and took off. And I worked on my own. It's a completely independent project. I had no official association with Bruce or his management. I just worked on my own for 18 months and, talked to as many people as I could, and eventually got a call from John Landau, Bruce's manager.
Yeah, what was that like the day the phone rang?
It was terrific because it was a Friday afternoon. It was the end of the afternoon of my first week I'd taken off for my book leave from my then job at the Oregonian newspaper. And I'm budgeting out my time for these months I was going to have away and trying to figure out what I needed to do, what hurdles I needed to clear, what were my top priorities. And, of course, my top priority was, getting to Bruce. How do I get to Bruce? How do I get to Bruce? The phone rang. I picked it up. It's like, "Peter, this is John Landau. Do you know who I am?" And I was like, "As a matter of fact." He said, "Do you have time to talk?" And I was like, "As a matter of fact, I do." So we talked for a while, and that went well. And it turned out I was going to be in New York the next week, so we got together to have a drink and chat for a while. And by the time that was over, he said, "Look, we're ready to cooperate with you." So, as he said delightfully, and he said, "I'll give you the keys to the kingdom."
And it's one of the fun things as you're reading along, if there's a quote by someone, there's another quote by Bruce going, "Well, I don't quite remember it that way."
Yeah, that was part of the process with him, because Bruce has been very good at kind of mythologizing his life in a sense. And it's not to say that he tells whole cloth lies about stuff in his past, but as a writer and as somebody who's just a masterful storyteller, he knows how to take the essence of a truth and create a setting for it where it becomes so majestic. Mm-hmm. The story of his meeting with Clarence Clemons and how, Clarence walked through the door of the Student Prince on Kingsley Street in Asbury Park, and the door blew off its hinges. And it's like, so I was talking to Gary Talent, Bruce's bass player, about this, and I was like, "Well, what's your memory of that?" And he goes, "I don't remember that. You'd think I would. I was there with those guys. It's like I knew there was a storm, but then I talked to Clarence, and he was like, 'Oh no, that door blew right down the street.'" And I kept going back, "Well, which door? Was it like a screen door outside the main door?" He's like, No. This is the big, heavy door. The door that when you close it and lock it, that place is closed." And so, there was a little bit of disagreement, a little bit factual sort of whatever. But then I went to Bruce and I said, "Well, there's different opinions about this. People have different memories. Clarence swore that this was true, and he said he would be right." And I said, "But these other guys say something different." they would be wrong.
See, now that's how you clear up a story succinctly, just like that.
Yeah. So I thought, all right, well, that says, on a transcendent level, on a spiritual level, for, the significance of that moment, the significance of that evening, it's like it would be equally true to say that when Clarence walked through the door, the entire place blew up.
Absolutely. You mentioned something, the way that Bruce tells a story and has this mythology going, but also the way his music is written. And there was an interesting point in the book, too, that he doesn't read a lot of books, but he watched a lot of movies, and they were his muse for his narrative telling.
Yeah, and I think it was, he grew up with movies and cowboy movies and B movies, and he really liked those kind of noir mysteries where, sort of the lone guy sort of in this world that's dark and shifty and a little twisty. He said people for whom, the sands were always shifting under their feet. And he identified with those guys, and I think also as he became more conscious of narrative and more conscious of framing a story, he became completely enamored of how directors, the great directors, can tell so much story just by what's in the shot and how they frame the shot. And that became something that was hugely influential on how he wrote his songs. The details that he throws in, the details that he leaves out, these little telling things that happen, just the cold taste of beer going down this guy's throat when he's sawing the barrel off of a shotgun to go off and do bad things. It's like that he got that from the movies. But though for the last 35 years he's been a huge reader too. I mean, he's one of the great autodidacts of rock and roll.
I want to talk about some of the men in his life, and one that I didn't really remember was Clive Davis. I never think about Clive Davis at Columbia Records.
Yeah, he was very influential because when John Hammond, the great talent scout and A&R man, brought Bruce to Clive, it was kind of Clive's just, call to make. Like, I've got this guy, I think he's fantastic. And of course, John had a lot of street cred because he's the guy that brought them Billie Holiday and and Bob Dylan and on and on and on. So you listen to this guy, but Clive was like, well, let me hear it, get me the tape. So he listens and he gets through like 2 songs and he's like, oh yeah, this is it. Sign this guy. And he was his big supporter in the beginning. I mean, Clive was all in on Bruce, but then he left the company, I think, by the end of '73, at which point, kind of Bruce was left a little bit dangling in the wind. The new guys were more sort of enamored of Billy Joel and that thing. But, but Bruce had a core of sort of almost cult-like supporters inside Columbia. And a handful of guys who probably, together made that guy's career happen, along with Mike Appel, Bruce's first manager. But they just refused to let their bosses drop Bruce. Yeah. It's like they wanted to, but these guys were like, no! And back and the culture at Columbia, which is one of the great music companies ever, was such that if people there believed that strongly in someone, then you had to go with them. Yeah. You had to back them up.
And let's talk about Mike Appel, because it's hard to imagine that anyone could sign a contract worse than Colonel Parker and Elvis. Right. But that deal was crazy. And yet, there are still these words of kindness from Bruce.
Well, he wouldn't be where he is without Mike. I mean, Mike made him a star. And it was Mike's passion that got him into John Hammond's office. It was Mike's just complete sort of gangster-like way of taking people by the lapels and saying things like, Bruce Springsteen isn't a rock and roll act, he's a religion. And he believed it, and he mortgaged his house, he quit his job, he put his whole future on the line because he believed that strongly in Bruce Springsteen. But as somebody said, I mean, there's kind of a built-in tragedy there, which is that, the things that made Mike great also sort of ended up kind of undoing him a little bit. But again, I think that's true of so many people. And it's kind of a poignant story. And Mike is a very smart, very sweet, very well-intended guy. And the fact is that for Bruce, what mattered about their relationship was that it wasn't business as far as he was concerned. It was a friendship. It was, a brotherhood, a camaraderie. So when they shook hands, he figured that's all I really need to know. And this guy has given up so much. And there's some people who wonder whether Mike was even all that conversant, with what was in his contracts himself, because they were very, he just didn't, he was focused on this sort of religious like crusade to make this guy a star. And but then there were problems with the contracts, and that blew up in an ugly way. But they resolved it within 8 or 10 years, and and been buddies ever since.
Yeah. And Born to Run is the dividing line of his career.
That was the album that Bruce, the sort of the make or break record in 1975, where he really was on the line. And it was kind of like they wouldn't even give him the money. The way that the upper executives finally sort of worked out this deal with their cult-like A&R guys was, okay, I'll tell you what, we're going to give him the money to make a single. And if it's a good single and it sounds like it's going to be on the radio, we'll give him the rest of the money to make the third album. And so they gave him that money for the single, and he and Mike went into the studio and started working on Born to Run, the song, which took them 6 months to get perfect, because Bruce, they both became so obsessed with the idea, particularly Bruce, of making this note for note a perfect song. There could be nothing wrong with it, and they wanted to build it in the most elaborate way possible. He was talking about how he wanted the songs on this record, that this new record should sound like, the lyrics were by Bob Dylan, it was sung by Roy Orbison, and it was produced by Phil Spector. And that's a lot of high hurdles to get across. But they did it, and the moment that the then president of the company listened to that song, he said, "Oh yeah, that's it. That's a hit. Make the album." And that kind of like kept him going long enough to get to break through and start becoming this, the huge star that he's been basically ever since.
Very cool to think about. I also want to ask you about Clarence Clemons, because you were one of the last people to interview him, if not the last person to interview him. He said something that struck me in the book about how Bruce was in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. His saxophone is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but he is not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and neither is the E Street Band. You were in the room. What was his demeanor when he was talking about that?
Unhappy, visibly unhappy. A little sort of, obviously chagrined, a little amused by the irony of it. I think he understood what he had achieved in life and his significance to the Bruce Springsteen story and to Bruce's career and to rock and roll, just both as, as a musician, as a performer, and as, this great sort of, cross-cultural symbol in Bruce Springsteen's band. I mean, it was very powerful, especially back in 1973. It was extremely strange to have a racially mixed rock and roll band, because rock and roll players are all white, and rhythm and blues and soul players are all black, supposedly. Not so much, but that was the popular vision. And so, and he and Bruce together, Scooter and the Big Man, they knew, I think they always understood that when they were together, they both reflected and amplified each other's, spirit, in a sense. That there was this bond between them, and that it was enormously powerful, especially when they were on stage. The way that they would play off of each other, and Clarence was kind of Bruce's big brother and sort of strong man to stand against, and he sort of was this big sort of at times angelic and at times sinister character, like in 10th Avenue Freeze Out, he's that deep, sinister voice that says, "And kid, you better get the picture," But it's like, and that was kind of the role, and that there was something very beautiful and precious about that, and Bruce understood that and continues to understand that. So, why Clarence isn't in the Hall of Fame, why the E Street Band isn't in the Hall of Fame is a mystery to me.
And before we go, how do you think you would have fared at Cutthroat Monopoly?
Me?
Would you have brought enough ring-dings?
Ring-dings. Yeah, that would have been a good idea.
Did you ever eat ring-dings?
I've had the West Coast variation of ring-dings, which I think are called ding-dongs.
Ding-dongs.
Yeah, Bruce was really into the junk food back in the day. He ate like as I think I wrote in the book, had the gastronomical sophistication of a feral dog. Who knows why. He ate food, to the point where even when they were just 20, 21 years old, when they were on the road and they saw, they would go off to eat at a restaurant, and Bruce would go to a convenience store and buy sacks full of junk food. And eventually they got to the point where these rowdy guys, these drinkers and pot smokers, Bruce was never one of those, would grab him by the elbows and carry him to a restaurant to sit down and eat a meal with vegetables and solid protein, because they knew that, you know, he was going to break down on this junk food. You know, and they needed him to be strong and at the center of the stage. And so, you know, we let him do that. And
And now that you've been indoctrinated to all things down the shore, where was your favorite place to eat?
let us say Federici's in Freehold.
You had a slice there with somebody important.
Yeah. Well, I had already been there. I think one of the things that I had made a habit of going there. Someone said, well, you know, that's the best place in town. It's also Bruce's place. So when I was staying in Freehold, I would eat dinner there all the time. And they're really sweet and friendly. And once a friend of mine in Freehold named Kevin Coyne and his family, I brought my family down the shore to see the place and walk around a little bit where I'd been working. And so we all went to Federici's for dinner together. And 3 months later, I was back there, and I finally, you know, when I finally got to talk to Bruce and meet him, and we went out. First thing we did was go out for a drink to Federici's and have some pizza. And we were sitting down, and the owner came up to talk to Bruce and say hi. And Bruce said to me, he goes, "You ever been here before?" And I said, "Yeah, all the time." I said, "I was just sitting over there, that table over there with Kevin Coyne and his family like 8 weeks ago." And the guy goes like, "Yeah, you were. You guys were right over there. There's like 10 of you, right?" And I was like, "Yeah, exactly." And he goes, "Yeah." And Bruce was like, "Ooh." And I thought, oh, I think I scored there. That was good.
Yeah, that's how you score down the shore. Absolutely. The book is Bruce. Peter Ames Carlin, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.